What I'm about to tell you is going to haunt you. And I need you to understand something right from the start. This isn't just another cold case. This is the story of a woman who vanished in plain sight during one of the darkest weeks in American history. A woman whose disappearance was swallowed whole by chaos and grief. A woman who was hidden so perfectly, so completely, that it took 23 years and a sledgehammer to find her. Her name was Rebecca Halloway. And for over 2 decades, she was 3 floors above her own grave. This is the Riverside Drive Mystery. Let's go back to the summer of 2001. New York City. The city that never sleeps. Nearly 8 million people crammed into 5 boroughs, all living their lives, chasing their dreams, just existing in this massive, beautiful, chaotic organism of humanity. And in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in a pre-war brownstone on Riverside Drive, there lived a woman named Rebecca Halloway. Rebecca was 34 years old. She'd grown up in Albany, moved to the city when she was 25, and had spent the last 9 years building what most people would call a good life. Not glamorous, not exciting, but good, solid, real. She worked as a paralegal at Chen & Associates, a small law firm in Midtown that specialized in corporate law. Her boss, David Chen, would later describe her as the most organized person I've ever met. Rebecca was the person who remembered everyone's birthdays, who made sure the office coffee pot was always full, who stayed late to help junior associates with their case files even though it wasn't technically her job. She lived alone in apartment 3B at 315 Riverside Drive. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, maybe 600 square feet of space that she'd turned into something cozy. Plants in the windows. Books stacked on every available surface. Photos of her family covering the refrigerator. And a cat, a big orange tabby named Pumpkin who she'd adopted from a shelter 3 years earlier. Rebecca wasn't the type of person who stood out in a crowd. She was 5 feet 4 inches, slender build, with shoulder-length brown hair and these warm hazel eyes that her best friend Lauren said, always looked like she was really listening to you, you know? She dressed practically, lots of cardigans and comfortable shoes. She took the subway to work every day. She got her coffee from the same bodega on the corner. She called her mom every Sunday morning. By all accounts, Rebecca Halloway was normal. Beautifully, wonderfully normal. She had a small circle of close friends. Her best friend, Lauren Martinez, had met her in 2000 at a book club that met at a cafe in the West Village. They'd bonded over their mutual love of mystery novels. And oh, the irony of that is not lost on me. Lauren would later say that Rebecca was the kind of friend who showed up. No matter what. If you needed her at 2 a.m., she was there. Rebecca was close with her family. Her mother, Patricia, lived in Albany with Rebecca's stepfather, Frank. Her younger sister, Jennifer, was married with a 3-year-old daughter, Rebecca's niece, Emma, who she absolutely adored. Rebecca drove up to Albany once a month, without fail, just to see them. Just to be Aunt Becca. She wasn't dating anyone seriously in 2001, though she'd been on a few dates that summer. Nothing had clicked. Lauren remembered her saying something like, "I'm not worried about it. The right person will show up when they show up." Music shifts slightly, hint of darkness. She had routines. We all do, right? But Rebecca's were clockwork. She left for work every weekday at 7:45 a.m. She'd stop at Mario's bodega for a large coffee, milk, 2 sugars, and a banana. She'd be at her desk by 8:30. She'd eat lunch at her desk, usually a salad she'd brought from home. She'd leave work at 5:30, sometimes 6 o'clock if things were busy. She'd stop at the grocery store on Wednesdays. She did her laundry on Saturday mornings. She went to the same yoga class on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Routine. Predictable. Safe. And that's important. Because when someone with routines that's solid suddenly vanishes, it means something went very, very wrong. September 11th, 2001. I don't need to tell you what happened that day. You know. The world knows. 2 planes. The Twin Towers. The Pentagon. United 93. Nearly 3,000 people dead. America changed forever in a single morning. New York City became the center of the world's grief. Rebecca was at work when it happened. The office was in Midtown, far enough from downtown that they weren't in immediate danger, but close enough that they could see the smoke. Close enough that the office shook when the towers fell. Close enough that everyone in that building knew someone who was down there. David Chin later told police that Rebecca had been shocked, like we all were. She tried calling her family repeatedly but couldn't get through. The phone lines were overwhelmed. She'd stayed in the office until about 2 p.m., and then David sent everyone home. "What were we supposed to do?" he said. "Keep working." The world was ending. Rebecca walked home that day. The subways were shut down. It took her almost 2 hours to walk from Midtown to the Upper West Side, joining thousands of other New Yorkers all heading north, all covered in ash and shock. Lauren spoke to her that night. Rebecca had called her around 9 p.m., once she'd finally gotten through. They talked for almost an hour. Lauren remembered it clearly. She'd been interviewed dozens of times over the years. Rebecca sounded exhausted, Lauren said. Scared. But also weirdly calm, you know? Like she was trying to process something too big to actually process. She kept saying, "I can't believe this is real. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up." We talked about her family. She'd finally gotten through to her mom. We talked about my boyfriend at the time, whether he was okay. And then, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Lauren, if something ever happens to me, promise you won't let people forget about me. Promise you'll make sure someone cares." Lauren had laughed it off at the time. She thought Rebecca was just being morbid, you know, given the circumstances. She told her, "Nothing's going to happen to you, Beck. Don't talk like that." But Rebecca had insisted. "Just promise me." So Lauren promised. That was the last conversation they ever had. September 12, 2001. Rebecca went to work. The office was half empty. A lot of people couldn't bring themselves to go back yet. But Rebecca showed up. She was quiet that day, David remembered. She kept watching the news on the small TV they'd brought into the break room. She cried at her desk once mid-morning, but then wiped her face and got back to work. She left at 5 p.m. that day, earlier than usual. David Chen was the last person at the office to see Rebecca alive. She'd waved goodbye to him from the doorway, said, "See you tomorrow," and walked out. She stopped at the grocery store on her way home. The receipt was later found in her apartment, time-stamped at 5:47 p.m. She bought basics: bread, eggs, milk, cat food. The cashier didn't remember her specifically. Why would he? It was just another transaction. Security footage from the bodega across from her building showed Rebecca entering 315 Riverside Drive at 6:23 p.m. She was carrying a grocery bag. She looked tired. She went inside. And then, nothing. September 13, 2001. A Thursday. Rebecca didn't show up for work. Now, in any other circumstance, this would have been alarming. Rebecca didn't miss work. She was reliable to a fault. But this wasn't any other circumstance. This was September 2001. The city was still reeling. People were taking time off. Offices were understanding. Grief was everywhere. David Chin tried calling her around 10 a.m. No answer. He figured she was taking a personal day. He left a voicemail. "Hey Rebecca, just checking in. Hope you're okay. Take the time you need." Lauren tried calling her around noon. She'd wanted to get lunch, just to check on each other, you know? But Rebecca didn't pick up. Lauren sent her a message on her pager. "Yeah, remember those?" But never got a response. By 6 p.m., Lauren was worried. This wasn't like Rebecca. So she went to her apartment. 315 Riverside Drive. A beautiful old brownstone, built in the 1920s, with that classic New York charm. High ceilings, crown molding, big windows looking out over the street. 5 floors, divided into apartments. Rebecca was on the 3rd floor. Lauren climbed the stairs. The elevator was broken, had been for weeks, and knocked on apartment 3B. No answer. She knocked again. Louder. Becca. You in there? Nothing. And then Lauren tried the doorknob. And it turned. The door was unlocked. Lauren stepped inside. Imagine you're Lauren for a second. You walk into your best friend's apartment, expecting to find her sick in bed, or maybe asleep, or just having a rough day. But what you find instead is nothing wrong. Everything is normal. The apartment looked exactly like it always did. No signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. The plants were watered. The cat, Pumpkin, was sitting on the back of the couch, meowing for food. Rebecca's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her wallet was inside it. Her keys, apartment keys, office keys, car keys, were sitting right next to the purse. Her cell phone was plugged into the charger on the kitchen wall, battery full. In the bedroom, the bed was made. Clothes were hanging neatly in the closet. Her work bag was by the door, like she'd been planning to grab it on her way out in the morning. In the bathroom, her toothbrush was in the holder. Her prescription medication, she took something for anxiety, was in the medicine cabinet, half full. Everything Rebecca would need to leave her apartment, her money, her keys, her phone, her ID, was still there. But Rebecca wasn't. Lauren called out for her. Checked every room, even though the apartment was tiny. Checked the bathroom, the closet, under the bed. I know it sounds crazy, but when you're panicking, you check everywhere, right? Rebecca wasn't there. Lauren's hands were shaking when she pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. The call came in at 6:47 p.m. 911, what's your emergency? Hi, I need to report a missing person. My friend, she's not here, but her door was unlocked and all her stuff is here and I don't know where she is. Okay ma'am, slow down. What's your location? 315, Riverside Drive, apartment 3B, Upper West Side. And when did you last see or speak to your friend? 2 nights ago, September 11th. We talked on the phone. Ma'am, it's only been 2 days. Is it possible she's with family? Given everything that's happened. No, you don't understand. This isn't like her. Her phone is here. Her purse is here. Her keys are here. She didn't just leave. Something's wrong. Ma'am, it's only been 2 days. Is it possible she's with family? Given everything that's happened. No, you don't understand. This isn't like her. Her phone is here. Her purse is here. Her keys are here. She didn't just leave. Something's wrong. 2 NYPD officers arrived at 315 Riverside Drive at 7:34 p.m. Officers Ramirez and O'Connor. They took Lauren's statement, walked through the apartment, took notes. And I want to be clear about something here. These officers did their jobs. They were professional. They were thorough, given the circumstances. But you have to understand what New York was like in September 2001. The NYPD was stretched beyond breaking. Every officer was working double shifts. The entire department was focused on ground zero, on security, on preventing another attack, on dealing with a traumatized city. Missing persons cases, especially ones involving adults with no signs of foul play, were low priority. And that's what this looked like. An adult woman, no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. Her door had been unlocked, sure, but maybe she'd just forgotten to lock it. Maybe she'd gone to stay with family upstate. Maybe she'd needed space after September 11th. God knows a lot of people did. The officers filed a report. They took photos of the apartment. They took Rebecca's hairbrush for DNA, just in case. They interviewed Lauren, got her contact information, and told her to call if Rebecca turned up. Then they left. For the next 48 hours, Lauren called the NYPD every few hours. She called Rebecca's family. Her mother was frantic, caught the first train down from Albany. Patricia Halloway arrived on September 15th and immediately went to the police. Patricia was a force. A mother who knew, in her bones, that something terrible had happened to her daughter. She demanded they treat this seriously. She demanded they investigate. And they did, kind of. Detective Michael Corso was assigned to the case on September 16th. Corso was a 20-year veteran of the NYPD, worked out of the 20th precinct. He was a good detective, that's important. This wasn't incompetence. This was a good cop dealing with an impossible situation. Corso interviewed everyone in Rebecca's life. Her co-workers, her friends, her family. He pulled her phone records, her credit card statements, her bank records. He checked hospitals, morgues, Jane Doe reports. He filed a missing persons report with the National Crime Information Center. He distributed flyers with Rebecca's photo all over the Upper West Side. He did everything right. And he found absolutely nothing. No one had seen Rebecca since she entered her building on September 12th at 6:23 p.m. No one had heard from her. Her bank account hadn't been touched. Her credit cards hadn't been used. Her Metro card, yeah, they checked that too, hadn't been swiped. It was like Rebecca Halloway had simply ceased to exist. Detective Corso focused heavily on 315 Riverside Drive. Because if Rebecca had vanished from inside her apartment, then someone in that building might know something. Let me paint you a picture of this place. 315 Riverside Drive was built in 1923. Classic New York brownstone architecture. 5 stories, 6 apartments total, plus a basement. The building had a small lobby with mailboxes and a staircase. The elevator, as I mentioned, was broken and had been since late August. There was no doorman, no security cameras in the lobby or halls. The front door had a lock, but it was old and temperamental. Residents complained it didn't always latch properly. The basement was accessible through a door in the back of the lobby. It housed the building's boiler, water heater, storage units for each apartment, and a lot of junk that had accumulated over the decades. The super had keys to everything, including the basement. Speaking of which, let's talk about the residents in September 2001. Apartment 1A, elderly couple, the Greenbergs. Both in their 70s. Morris and Ruth. They'd lived there since 1968. Sweet people, kept to themselves mostly. They told Corso they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Ruth had been friends with Rebecca. They'd chat sometimes when they passed in the hall. Apartment 1B, young couple, Brad and Simone Porter. Late 20s, both worked in finance. They'd moved in that July. They barely knew Rebecca, had maybe said hello twice. They were out of town on September 12th to 13th, visiting family in New Jersey after September 11th. Apartment 2A, single guy, James Delgado. 42, worked nights as a hospital administrator. He was home during the day, sleeping. Saw nothing, heard nothing. Seemed genuinely sorry about Rebecca but had no information. Apartment 2B, empty. Had been vacant since July when the previous tenants moved out. The landlord was planning to renovate it. Apartment 3B, Rebecca. Apartment 4A, 2 roommates, Kevin Marsh and Tyler Benson. Both 29, worked in tech. They'd known Rebecca casually. They'd all complained about the broken elevator together a few times. They'd been at work on September 12th, out drinking after work on the 13th. Neither had useful information. Apartment 4B, single woman, Diane Kowalski. 51, high school teacher. She'd known Rebecca better than most. They'd shared keys at one point so Diane could water Rebecca's plants when she went to Albany. Diane was devastated. She told Corso that Rebecca was the nicest person in the building. No information about her disappearance. Apartment 5A, artist, Marcus Chen, no relation to Rebecca's boss. 36, painter, kept weird hours. He'd been in his apartment on September 12th to 13th working. Hadn't heard anything unusual. His apartment was on the opposite side of the building from Rebecca's, so that wasn't surprising. Apartment 5B, Anthony and Maria Rodriguez. 60s, retired. They'd lived there since 1983. They liked Rebecca, worried about her. No information. And then there was the building superintendent, Kenneth Voss. Kenneth was 45 years old in 2001. He'd been the super at 315 Riverside since 1995. He lived in a small apartment in a building 3 blocks away. The owner of 315 Riverside also owned that building, and Kenneth's rent was part of his compensation package. Kenneth was responsible for maintenance, repairs, collecting rent, dealing with tenant complaints. He had master keys to every apartment in the building. He had access to the basement. He knew every inch of that place. The plumbing, the electrical, the weird quirks that only someone who'd worked there for 6 years would know. Detective Corso interviewed Kenneth on September 18th. Kenneth was soft-spoken, seemed nervous but cooperative. He said he'd seen Rebecca around, but didn't know her well. He said he'd been at his own apartment on the nights of September 12th and 13th, alone. No alibi, but also no reason for suspicion. Corso asked if anything unusual had happened in the building recently. Kenneth said no. Corso asked about access to the building and apartments. Kenneth explained the key system, confirmed that only he and the landlord had master keys. Corso asked if he'd noticed Rebecca's door being unlocked on September 13th. Kenneth said he hadn't been in the building that day. He'd taken a few days off after September 11th, like a lot of people. The interview lasted 45 minutes. Corso took notes, thanked Kenneth for his cooperation, and left. There was nothing there. No red flags. Just a quiet, slightly awkward building super who seemed as baffled as everyone else. On September 21, 2001, exactly 10 days after September 11th, Kenneth Voss called the landlord and gave 2 weeks' notice. He said he was moving to Pennsylvania to be closer to his sister. Family stuff. The landlord was annoyed but understanding. People were leaving New York in droves after the attacks. Kenneth worked his last day on October 4th. He moved to Pennsylvania on October 6th. Detective Corso didn't find out about this until October 15th, when he stopped by the building to ask Kenneth a follow-up question and was told by a tenant that there was a new super. Corso tracked down Kenneth's forwarding address and called him. Kenneth answered. Said he'd been meaning to let Corso know he'd moved, but it had slipped his mind. Everything had been so hectic. Corso asked if Kenneth would be willing to come back to New York for another interview. Kenneth said sure, but could it wait a few weeks? He was settling in, starting a new job. Corso said fine. They scheduled a tentative interview for early November. That interview never happened. Because by November, the case had gone cold. For the first 6 months after Rebecca disappeared, Detective Corso worked the case hard. He ran every lead, no matter how small. Someone reported seeing a woman matching Rebecca's description at Port Authority bus terminal on September 14th. Corso pulled security footage, spent hours reviewing it. Turned out to be someone else. An anonymous tip came in suggesting Rebecca might have been having an affair with a married co-worker. Corso tracked it down, interviewed the co-worker, confirmed it was baseless gossip. A psychic, and yes, this actually happened, contacted the NYPD claiming to have visions of Rebecca near water. Corso followed up on it because you follow up on everything. The psychic led police to the Hudson River near the 79th Street boat basin. They searched. Found nothing. Rebecca's case got some media attention in late September and early October 2001, but not much. Because, again, the world was focused on other things. A missing paralegal from the Upper West Side couldn't compete with 24/7 coverage of the war on terror, anthrax attacks, and Afghanistan. But Patricia Halloway made sure people didn't forget her daughter. Patricia was relentless. She printed thousands of flyers with Rebecca's photo and blanketed Manhattan. She stood on street corners handing them out. She contacted every TV station, every newspaper, begging them to cover the story. She got a few local news segments. Missing woman in Upper West Side, family desperate for answers. Those kinds of pieces. But they aired once, maybe twice, and then disappeared. Patricia started a tip line with her own money. She offered a $10,000 reward for information, money she couldn't really afford to spend, but she spent it anyway. She hired a private investigator in early 2002, a former NYPD detective named Harold Kincaid. Harold worked the case for 4 months, ran up thousands of dollars in fees, and found nothing new. Rebecca's sister, Jennifer, created a website in 2003, findrebeccahalloway.com. It had photos, information, a timeline of her disappearance, and a place for people to submit tips. The tips that came in were mostly dead ends or conspiracy theories. Lauren, Rebecca's best friend, couldn't let it go either. She called Detective Corso weekly for the first year, then monthly, then every few months. She kept Rebecca's case alive on early internet forums dedicated to missing persons. She wrote letters to the mayor's office, the police commissioner, anyone who might listen. And Detective Corso? He didn't give up either. Even as the case went cold, even as he was assigned new cases that took priority, Corso kept Rebecca's file on his desk. He'd review it every few months, looking for something he might have missed. He re-interviewed witnesses in 2002, 2003, and 2004. He followed up on every tip that came through the hotline, no matter how unlikely. But there was nothing. No body. No witnesses. No evidence. Rebecca Halloway had vanished into thin air. When someone disappears without a trace, people start speculating. They can't help it. The human brain hates unsolved mysteries. We need answers, even if we have to make them up ourselves. So let's talk about the theories that circulated about Rebecca Halloway. Theory number 1. She ran away and started a new life. This was popular among people who didn't know Rebecca well. The logic went, she was single, no kids, no major ties to New York. Maybe she was overwhelmed by September 11th, decided to just leave. Hop on a bus, change her name, start over somewhere else. But anyone who actually knew Rebecca said this was impossible. She was close with her family. She loved her niece. She had a cat, for God's sake. And she left her purse, her money, her ID. You don't start a new life with literally nothing. Plus, her social security number was never used again. No new bank accounts, no employment records, no tax returns. If she'd started over, there would have been a paper trail somewhere. Theory number 2. She was a victim of the 9/11 attacks. Some people theorized that Rebecca had been downtown on September 12th or 13th, maybe volunteering, maybe paying respects, and had been killed somehow. Maybe she was hit by debris, or fell, or was in the wrong place during an aftershock. But there was no evidence she'd been downtown. No witnesses placed her there. Her Metro card wasn't used. And her body never turned up in any of the extensive searches of Ground Zero and the surrounding area. Theory number 3. She was abducted. This one was harder to dismiss. Maybe someone had grabbed her off the street, or forced their way into her apartment. Maybe she'd been taken and was being held somewhere, or had been trafficked. But again, no evidence. No signs of struggle in her apartment. No witnesses saw anything. And typically, abduction victims are taken opportunistically, quickly. Rebecca's apartment showed no signs of a rushed or violent entry. Theory number 4. She committed suicide. This theory hurt her family the most. People suggested that maybe Rebecca had been more affected by September 11th than she'd let on, that maybe she'd gone somewhere private and taken her own life. Patricia Halloway pushed back hard against this. Rebecca hadn't been depressed. She'd been scared and sad after September 11th. Who wasn't? But she wasn't suicidal. And even if she had been, where was her body? Suicide victims are almost always found, eventually. Lauren agreed. In that last phone call on September 11th, Rebecca had been shaken but not hopeless. She'd made plans to meet Lauren for lunch the following week. People who are planning to end their lives don't make lunch plans. Theory number 5. Foul play by someone she knew. This was Detective Corso's working theory, though he never had enough evidence to pursue it properly. Statistics tell us that when someone is murdered, it's usually by someone they know. A partner, an ex, a coworker, a neighbor, a friend. Corso looked hard at everyone in Rebecca's orbit. He investigated her ex-boyfriend from 2000, confirmed he'd moved to California months before she disappeared. He looked at male coworkers, found nothing suspicious. He re-interviewed everyone in her building multiple times. But he never had a strong suspect. Never had probable cause for a search warrant or an arrest. And then there was Kenneth Voss. Kenneth had bothered Corso from the beginning. Not because he'd done anything obviously wrong, but because he'd left right after Rebecca disappeared. And yes, lots of people left New York after September 11th, but the timing felt off. Corso drove out to Pennsylvania in 2003 to interview Kenneth again. Kenneth was living in a small town called Harrisburg, working as a maintenance technician at an apartment complex. He'd gained some weight, looked older, seemed settled. The interview was friendly, cooperative. Kenneth said he'd been following the case, hoped Rebecca would be found. Corso asked again about the days surrounding Rebecca's disappearance. Kenneth's story hadn't changed. He'd been home alone, hadn't seen anything, didn't know anything. Corso asked why he'd moved so suddenly. Kenneth explained that his sister had been sick, and after September 11th, he'd realized life was short. He wanted to be closer to family. Corso checked Kenneth's background. No criminal record. No history of violence. No complaints from tenants at his current job. Nothing. Kenneth Voss was a dead end. By 2005, Rebecca Halloway's case was officially cold. Detective Corso retired in 2006. He passed the case file to Detective Sarah Brennan, who inherited about 40 other cold cases along with it. Brennan was good, dedicated, but she had limited resources and a staggering workload. The NYPD's cold case squad reviewed Rebecca's file periodically, but without new evidence or leads, there was nothing to pursue. The case sat in a box in a warehouse in Queens, alongside thousands of other unsolved disappearances and murders. Patricia Halloway never gave up. She called the police every year on September 12th, the anniversary of the last confirmed sighting of her daughter. She kept the website updated. She aged in the way that parents of missing children age, hollowed out, haunted, living in a perpetual state of not knowing. Jennifer, Rebecca's sister, had another child. She named her daughter Rebecca, after the aunt she'd never know. Patricia became a grandmother twice over, but the joy was always tinged with absence. Lauren Martinez started a blog in 2012 called Forgotten Voices. It was dedicated to missing persons cases that had fallen through the cracks, that weren't getting media attention. Rebecca's case was featured prominently. Lauren interviewed experts, wrote detailed timelines, tried to keep people engaged. The blog got a decent following, a few thousand readers. But it didn't generate new leads. In 2015, there was a brief surge of renewed interest when a true crime podcast called Vanished did a 2-part episode on Rebecca's disappearance. It was well-researched, respectful, thorough. They interviewed Patricia, Lauren, and Detective Brennan. They walked listeners through the timeline, the theories, the frustrating lack of evidence. The episode was downloaded over 300,000 times. Tips flooded in, dozens of them. None of them panned out. Music swells slightly then fades. In 2018, Patricia Halloway was diagnosed with breast cancer. She fought it hard. She always said she couldn't die without knowing what happened to Rebecca. She beat it, went into remission, and kept fighting for her daughter. In 2020, COVID hit. The world shut down. Cold cases got even colder. By 2023, Rebecca Halloway had been missing for 22 years. She would have been 56 years old. Her case had been featured in magazines, podcasts, TV specials, and online forums. But she was still gone. Still unfound. Patricia was 76 years old. She still lived in Albany. She still called the police every September 12th. She still didn't know where her daughter was. And then, in March of 2024, a construction worker named Miguel Torres picked up a sledgehammer and changed everything. March 8, 2024. 3:15, Riverside Drive had been sold the previous year to a development company called Apex Urban Properties. They'd bought it for $4.2 million with plans to gut-renovate the entire building and convert it into high-end condos. Classic New York real estate story. The tenants had been given notice. Most had moved out by February. The Rodriguezes, that retired couple from apartment 5B, had been the last to leave. They'd lived there for 41 years. Maria had cried when they handed over their keys. By early March, the building was empty. Apex brought in a construction crew to start demolition. The plan was to preserve the facade, it was landmarked, but completely redo the interior. New plumbing, new electrical, new everything. The crew started with the basement. Miguel Torres was 34 years old, had been working construction for 12 years. He was part of a 5-man crew tasked with clearing out the basement so they could assess the building's foundation and mechanical systems. If you've never been in the basement of an old New York building, let me tell you, they're creepy as hell. Low ceilings, exposed pipes, dim lighting, decades of accumulated junk. And this one was particularly bad, cluttered with old furniture, broken appliances, mysterious boxes that nobody had touched since the 1970s. Miguel's job that day was to clear out a back corner of the basement that housed some old storage units. The units themselves were just plywood partitions, nothing fancy. Most of them had been emptied when tenants moved out, but there was still junk everywhere. Around 2:30 p.m., Miguel was working on demolishing one of the plywood walls when he noticed something odd. He'd been swinging a sledgehammer, breaking through the partition, when he felt the wall give way more than it should have. Behind the plywood, there was drywall. Old drywall, yellowed and water-stained. That was weird. Why would there be drywall behind a storage partition in a basement? Miguel called over his foreman, a guy named Tony Scarpetti. Tony looked at it, frowned, told Miguel to keep going carefully. Miguel took a few more swings. The sledgehammer punched through the drywall easily. It was old and brittle. And then, through the hole, Miguel saw something that made him stop. Brick. Behind the drywall was a brick wall, the original building wall from 1923. But there was a gap. A space between the drywall and the brick. Maybe 3 feet wide, running along the wall for about 8 feet. Miguel grabbed his flashlight and shined it through the hole. And that's when he saw the bones. Miguel dropped his flashlight. He literally dropped it and stepped back, his hands shaking. "Tony," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tony, there's something in there." Tony came over, looked through the hole, saw what Miguel saw, and immediately pulled out his phone and called 911. The NYPD arrived at 3:17 p.m. First responding officers secured the scene, confirmed what the construction workers had found, and called for detectives and the medical examiner. By 4 p.m., the basement of 315 Riverside Drive was a crime scene. Detective Sarah Brennan, remember her, she'd inherited Rebecca's case back in 2006, was the primary detective assigned. She arrived at 4:30, took one look at the location, and felt a cold pit form in her stomach. Because Brennan knew this building. She'd been here before, years ago, reviewing the Rebecca Halloway file. She knew that Rebecca had lived on the 3rd floor. Knew that she'd vanished without a trace. And now there were human remains in the basement. The medical examiner, Dr. Linda Park, arrived at 5 p.m. with her team. They carefully removed sections of the drywall to access the hidden space. Crime scene photographers documented everything. Evidence technicians took measurements, drew diagrams, collected samples. And slowly, carefully, they uncovered what had been hidden behind that wall for over 2 decades. A human skeleton, largely intact. The body had been placed in the space sitting upright, back against the brick wall. Natural mummification had occurred due to the cool, dry conditions. Some tissue remained, though most of it had deteriorated. Clothing was still present. Jeans, a cotton sweater, sneakers. Next to the remains was a leather purse. Dr. Park photographed the scene extensively before touching anything. Then, wearing gloves, she carefully opened the purse. Inside, a wallet. Inside the wallet, credit cards, $47 in cash, and a New York State driver's license. The license had a photo of a smiling woman with shoulder-length brown hair and hazel eyes. The name on the license, Rebecca and Halloway. Detective Brennan stood there in that basement, staring at that driver's license, and felt emotions she rarely allowed herself to feel on the job. Grief, anger, and something else, a kind of terrible relief. Because after 23 years, Rebecca Halloway had been found. She'd been 3 floors below her apartment. The remains were carefully extracted from the hidden space and transported to the office of the chief medical examiner. Dr. Park and her team worked through the night conducting the preliminary examination. Cause of death was determined within hours: blunt force trauma to the posterior skull. A massive blow to the back of the head, hard enough to fracture the occipital bone and cause fatal brain injury. Based on the injury pattern, the weapon was likely something heavy and cylindrical. A pipe wrench, a crowbar, something in that category. The blow would have been fatal almost immediately. Rebecca likely died within minutes, possibly seconds. There were no defensive wounds on the remains, no broken fingers, no signs of a struggle. This suggested she'd been struck from behind, without warning. She never saw it coming. Dental records confirmed identity within 24 hours. The remains were definitively those of Rebecca and Halloway, missing since September 12, 2001. Time of death was estimated to be late evening of September 12 or early morning of September 13, 2001, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance. The clothing Rebecca was wearing matched what she'd been seen wearing on security footage when she entered the building on September 12. Her watch had stopped at 8:47 p.m., likely the time of death, or close to it. Now, here's where the investigation got interesting. The false wall that had hidden Rebecca's body was constructed from materials that were readily available in the building itself. The drywall was the same type used throughout 315 Riverside Drive. The screws and framing were standard hardware store items. The workmanship was competent but not professional. Someone with basic handyman skills could have built it. And here's the thing, constructing that wall would have taken time. Hours, probably. You'd need to frame it out, attach the drywall, tape and mud the seams, let it dry. This wasn't a panic disposal. The purse and its contents were examined extensively. No fingerprints were recoverable. Too much time had passed, too much degradation. But the items inside told a story. Her wallet contained her driver's license, credit cards, a debit card, $47 in cash, her MetroCard, her gym membership card, a photo of her niece Emma, and a receipt from the grocery store dated September 12, 2001, at 5:47 p.m. Her keys were not in the purse. That was odd. Her keys had been found in her apartment, remember? Whoever had hidden Rebecca's body had taken her keys, gone to her apartment, and left them there. Staged the scene to make it look like she'd simply vanished. This was premeditated. This was planned. Detective Brennan knew immediately what she was dealing with. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random attack. This was someone who knew the building, who had time and access, who was smart enough to hide a body so well it stayed hidden for 23 years. She pulled out her phone and made a call to the cold case squad. "Pull every file we have on 315 Riverside Drive," she said. "Every interview, every photo, every scrap of paper. And find out who had access to that basement in September." The discovery of Rebecca's remains made national news within 24 hours. Body of woman missing since 2001 found behind false wall in Manhattan basement, read the New York Times headline. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, everyone covered it. The story had everything: a cold case, a mysterious disappearance during 9/11, and a shocking discovery 23 years later. Patricia Halloway was notified by Detective Brennan personally on March 9, 2024. Patricia was 77 years old now. She'd spent 23 years not knowing where her daughter was. And now, finally, she knew. "I always knew she hadn't just left," Patricia told reporters through tears. "I knew someone had hurt her. I knew she was gone. But not knowing where she was, that was torture. Now at least." Detective Brennan assembled a task force. The case was now a homicide investigation, and despite the passage of time, she was determined to find Rebecca's killer. The first step was re-examining everyone who'd had access to the building in September 2001. Brennan pulled the original case file, all 400 pages of it, and started cross-referencing. Most of the former tenants were easy to locate. Morris Greenberg had died in 2015, but his wife Ruth was still alive, living in a nursing home in Queens. The Porters, that young couple from 1B, had divorced in 2010. Brad was now in Connecticut, Simone in California. James Delgado from 2A had moved to Florida. Diane Kowalski from 4B had retired to North Carolina. Kevin Marsh and Tyler Benson had both moved to different states, lost touch with each other. All of them were contacted and re-interviewed. None of them had any new information. None of them had criminal histories. None of them pinged Brennan's radar. And then there was Kenneth Voss, the building superintendent who'd quit his job and left New York 10 days after Rebecca disappeared. Brennan pulled up Kenneth's information. Last known address, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Last known employer, Riverside Garden Apartments, where he'd worked as a maintenance technician. She called the apartment complex. Kenneth had left that job in 2019, retired early, they said. He'd been a good employee, no complaints. Brennan ran Kenneth through every database available. No criminal record. No arrests. No red flags. But he'd had master keys to the building. He'd had access to the basement. He'd had the skills to build a false wall. And he'd left town right after Rebecca. It took Brennan 2 days to track down Kenneth Voss's current address. He was living in a small ranch house in a quiet suburb outside Harrisburg. The house was modest, probably 2 bedrooms, well-maintained lawn, an old sedan in the driveway. Retirement living. Brennan brought backup, Detective James Wu from the NYPD and 2 Pennsylvania State Police officers. Just in case. They knocked on Kenneth's door at 9 a.m. on March 15, 2024. Kenneth answered. He was 68 years old now, gray-haired, a little heavier, wearing reading glasses and a cardigan. He looked like someone's grandfather. Kenneth Voss? Brennan asked, holding up her badge. Kenneth looked at the badge. Then at Brennan. Then at the other officers behind her. And he said, in a quiet, resigned voice, "I knew you'd come eventually." Kenneth invited them inside without resistance. No running, no fighting, no lawyer demands. He sat down in his living room, a neat, tidy space filled with books and old furniture, and he just deflated. "You found her," he said. It wasn't a question. "We found Rebecca Halloway's remains in the basement of 315 Riverside Drive," Brennan confirmed. "Do you know how they got there, Kenneth?" Kenneth was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I put her there," he said. Detective Wu immediately read Kenneth his Miranda rights. Kenneth waived them. Said he didn't want a lawyer. Said he was tired of carrying this around. And then Kenneth Voss told them everything. Kenneth's confession was recorded. It lasted 3 hours. What he described was chilling in its banality. Not because it was elaborate or sophisticated, but because it was so simple. So preventable. Kenneth admitted that he'd been obsessed with Rebecca for over a year. He'd watch her come and go. He'd let himself into her apartment when she wasn't home, just to look around, he said, to feel close to her. He'd go through her things, her photos, her clothes. He'd convinced himself that they had a connection, that she felt something for him too, even though they'd barely spoken. On the night of September 12, 2001, Kenneth used his master key to enter Rebecca's apartment around 8:30 p.m. He said he just wanted to talk to her. He said he'd been feeling emotional after September 11th, and he thought maybe she'd understand, maybe they could comfort each other. But when Rebecca came out of her bedroom and saw Kenneth standing in her living room uninvited, she didn't understand. She was terrified. She told him to get out. She said she was going to call the police. She said he was scaring her. Kenneth said he panicked. He said he couldn't let her call the police, couldn't let her ruin everything. He'd brought a pipe wrench with him. He always carried tools as part of his job, and in a moment of rage and fear, he struck her from behind. One blow. She fell. She didn't get back up. Kenneth said he stood there for several minutes, staring at what he'd done, unable to process it. Then survival instinct kicked in. He wrapped Rebecca's body in a tarp from his maintenance supplies. He waited until after midnight, when the building was quiet, and carried her down to the basement. He spent the next 6 hours building a false wall in a back corner of the basement, hiding her body behind it. Then he went to Rebecca's apartment, took her purse to make it look more realistic, left her keys on the counter, and wiped down anything he'd touched. He said he was going to stay, going to act normal. But after a few days, he couldn't take it. Couldn't be in that building anymore. So he quit and left. He said he'd spent 23 years waiting for someone to find her. Waiting for police to knock on his door. And in some twisted way, Kenneth Voss was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. He was extradited to New York in March 2024. Kenneth Voss's trial began in July 2024. His public defender argued for a plea deal. Kenneth was willing to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was 68 years old, had no prior record, and had cooperated fully with the investigation. But the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michelle Torres, pushed for the maximum sentence. This wasn't just murder, it was a murder that had stolen 23 years of closure from a grieving family. In the end, Kenneth accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and improper disposal of human remains. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to recommend 25 years to life instead of pursuing a first-degree murder conviction that could have meant life without parole. On August 23, 2024, Kenneth Voss stood before a judge for sentencing. Patricia Halloway was there. So was Jennifer, Rebecca's sister. So was Lauren, Rebecca's best friend. The courtroom was packed with people who'd loved Rebecca, people who'd searched for her, people who'd never given up. The judge allowed victim impact statements. Patricia went first. She stood at the podium, 77 years old, her hands shaking, and read from a prepared statement. Kenneth Voss didn't just take my daughter's life, she said, her voice breaking. He took 23 years of my life too. 23 years of not knowing. Of hoping and praying and searching. Of going to bed every night wondering if she was suffering somewhere, if she needed me, if she was calling for me. He stole my chance to bury her properly. To say goodbye. To have closure. She paused, wiped her eyes, and continued. But he didn't win. Because Rebecca is remembered. She is loved. And she will never be forgotten. And I hope that every day Kenneth Voss spends in prison, he thinks about what he took from us. I hope he never knows peace. Lauren spoke next. She talked about her last conversation with Rebecca, about the promise she'd made to never let people forget her. I kept that promise, Lauren said, staring directly at Kenneth. And I always will. Jennifer spoke about her daughters, both named after their aunt. They'll know who Rebecca was, she said. They'll know she was loved. They'll know she mattered. Kenneth was given an opportunity to address the court. He stood, looked at the family, and said simply, I'm sorry. It's not enough, I know. But I'm sorry. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life. With his age and health, it's likely Kenneth Voss will die in prison. He was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look back. Rebecca and Halloway was laid to rest on October 12, 2024, in a cemetery in Albany, New York, next to her father, who had died when she was 15. The funeral was attended by over 200 people. Friends, family, former co-workers, people from the true crime community who'd followed her case for years, strangers who just wanted to pay their respects. Patricia stood at the graveside, flanked by her surviving daughter and granddaughters, and watched as her firstborn child was finally brought home. After the service, Lauren stood by the grave for a long time, alone. She placed a copy of Rebecca's favorite book, The Secret Garden, on top of the fresh dirt. I kept my promise, Beck, she whispered. I kept my promise. The case of Rebecca Halloway raised uncomfortable questions about how missing persons cases are handled, especially during times of crisis. If Rebecca had disappeared on September 10 instead of September 12, Would she have been found sooner? Would the investigation have been more thorough? Would Kenneth Voss have been caught before he left town? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: the NYPD made changes. The cold case squad received additional funding. Protocols were updated for handling missing persons cases during emergencies. Detective Corso, the original detective on Rebecca's case, was contacted after the arrest. He was 72 now, retired in Florida. When he heard that Rebecca had been found, he wept. "I knew something was wrong," he told reporters. "I knew someone had hurt her. I just couldn't prove it. If I'd pushed harder on Voss, maybe I could have prevented 23 years of pain." But Detective Brennan defended him publicly. "Detective Corso did everything right with the resources and information he had," she said. "This case wasn't solved because of mistakes made in 2001. It was solved because a wall came down in 2024. Sometimes that's how justice works, not when we want it, but when circumstances allow it." 315 Riverside Drive was sold again after the discovery. The development company decided to completely demolish the building and start over. Too much history. Too much darkness. As of October 2024, the lot is empty. There's a fence around it, and people sometimes leave flowers there. For Rebecca. For the woman who was hidden in plain sight for 23 years. The case of Rebecca Halloway raised uncomfortable questions about how missing persons cases are handled, especially during times of crisis. If Rebecca had disappeared on September 10th instead of September 12th, would she have been found sooner? Would the investigation have been more thorough? Would Kenneth Voss have been caught before he left town? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: the NYPD made changes. The cold case squad received additional funding. Protocols were updated for handling missing persons cases during emergencies. Detective Corso, the original detective on Rebecca's case, was contacted after the arrest. He was 72 now, retired in Florida. When he heard that Rebecca had been found, he wept. "I knew something was wrong," he told reporters. "I knew someone had hurt her. I just couldn't prove it. If I'd pushed harder on Voss, maybe I could have prevented 23 years of pain." But Detective Brennan defended him publicly. "Detective Corso did everything right with the resources and information he had," she said. "This case wasn't solved because of mistakes made in 2001. It was solved because a wall came down in 2024. Sometimes that's how justice works, not when we want it, but when circumstances allow it." 315 Riverside Drive was sold again after the discovery. The development company decided to completely demolish the building and start over. Too much history. Too much darkness. As of October 2024, the lot is empty. There's a fence around it, and people sometimes leave flowers there. For Rebecca. For the woman who was hidden in plain sight for 23 years. So what do we take away from the story of Rebecca Halloway? I think about the randomness of it. How Rebecca's entire fate hinged on a moment, on Kenneth Voss walking into her apartment that night, on her rejection triggering his violence, on a single swing of a pipe wrench. She was just living her life. Going to work, feeding her cat, calling her mom on Sundays. And then one night, someone who she barely knew, someone who'd built an entire fantasy in his head, took it all away from her. I think about Patricia, who spent 23 years in a kind of purgatory that most of us can't imagine. Not knowing is its own special kind of torture. At least now she knows. At least now she has somewhere to go, to sit, to talk to her daughter. I think about Lauren, who kept her promise. Who never let Rebecca be forgotten, even when the world moved on, even when the case went cold. That's friendship. That's love. And I think about the timeline. How if that building hadn't been sold, if that construction crew hadn't started demolition, if Miguel Torres's sledgehammer had hit the wall 6 inches to the left, Rebecca might never have been found. Kenneth might have died with his secret intact. But she was found. The wall came down. The truth came out. Justice is often slow. Sometimes it takes 23 years. Sometimes it takes a random act of construction and a sledgehammer, and a construction worker who looked in the right place at the right time. But it comes. Rebecca Ann Halloway was 34 years old when she died. She was kind, organized, reliable. She loved mystery novels. The irony is almost too much. She had a cat named Pumpkin. She called her mom every Sunday. She was planning to have lunch with her best friend the week she disappeared. She was ordinary. Beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. And she deserved better than what happened to her. But her story didn't end in that basement. It ended with her family getting answers. It ended with her killer in prison. It ended with her being laid to rest with dignity, surrounded by people who loved her. That's not nothing. If you or someone you know is dealing with a missing loved one, please don't give up. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding answers. Keep their memory alive. Because sometimes, even after 23 years, the truth comes out. And sometimes, justice finds its way home. Rest in peace, Rebecca Ann Halloway. You were never forgotten.